know who's involved, but perhaps she can require, and you can do something else for the course. And it's examples we talk about, but it's not going to necessarily exhaust Linz's intentions. For example, and I will talk about this later on, he refers to Columbia in the Introduction to Europe volume, and by implication also in his essay on equilibration. It's a case of re-equilibration, and certainly in the Colombian case, there was not a new constitution that was created after the end of the 10-year period. We'll talk about how relevant and how some of these cases fit, but I think just in terms of terminology, I kind of like redesign or reconstruction, and re-equilibration to me, it's somewhat funny for societies that perhaps cannot be said to have been equilibrated either before or after. What, of course, is relevant to real equilibration, the term, I'm using his term, and the idea of the course is that Linz has in mind not necessarily consistency, an extremely short period between one democracy and the other. And indeed, even if one can speak about breakdown, its authoritarian consequence would be, according to the basic concept, short. And in a way, the model, and I'll return to this in just a second, the model of the French shift from the Fourth to the Fifth Republic means that at most there is a 6-month interlude of authoritarian rule, and it is subsumed under the constitutionalist idea of emergency government. So in this sense, for re-equilibration, the cycle, the length of the cycle is very, very short. Linz introduces 2 other categories, and I think very useful for us to keep them all in mind: restoration and what is his term? I always get it wrong. Instauration. Restoration, instauration. Restoration is a relatively clear term from historiography. I think probably those of you who studied European history at one time or another will know that the term originates from 17th century England, the restoration of the Stuart monarchy, after an interlude of something like 11 years. Keep in mind the time element here. And we talked the same way about the Bourbon restoration too, of 1814, which is after 14 years. The king is executed in 1793. So it's 21 year after 21 year period. 10-year, 20-year period is still within the same order of magnitude. What is being restored in those 2 settings to historians is entirely clear: a dynasty, a monarchy. Stuarts in the one case, Bourbon in the other case. So happens that they are also either children, in the case of Charles II, or siblings of an executed monarch. So it's a restoration of a family and of a dynasty, and even a very close family. It's not entirely clear whether interpreters are sufficiently convincing about the nature of the restoration, because you can restore a monarchy or a dynasty. It does not mean the society is going to be the same as it was before. Talk about that because it's going to be relevant to some Latin American cases. Instauration for Linz means making a new political order. it means in most settings the creation of the making of a new constitution at the very least, but also the emergence of new elites, new personnel in charge of the political decision-making processes. So one could say that the time for re-equilibration is very short. For restoration, you can see these examples. You can't restore a family except after a short period of time. So it's a relatively short period, 10, in those two historical cases, 10 and 20 years. And instauration, though in principle it is not linked to a long period of time, it is one that would certainly follow after a long period of authoritarian rule. Let's take Spain from 1939 to 1975-6. It's it's almost 40-year period. So there's this time dimension. I would say that if you really wanted to even have a broader set of categories, it would be possible to add reform to this. The way that Linz described re-equilibration, it happens after a very serious crisis has already threatened the system and perhaps even brought it down. It's pretty ambiguous on that. Reform happens before that. But the goal of reformers is to manage potential crises, sometimes actual, but not necessarily fatal crises. So these are the basic categories. And I think if you actually look at Latin American history and the fluctuation of regime types within it, it's important to keep these different modalities clear. Again, my emphasis is on the element of time, but time is not the only factor. Obviously, short time, long time, 10 years, 20 years. So what happened by why not 30 years? No, the point is that Linz explicitly says it, is that a case of restoration, you can, an older personnel, older elite, this was two historical examples, the older ruler can return. In case of restorations, you have new ones. And so for time is somewhat related to that. The longer time, the more difficult it would be for previous ruling figures to once again play a role in politics. Now, Linz, as I said, has some ambivalence about that, about the relationship of instauration and the re-equilibration, but he does give a fairly precise list of what the elements of re-equilibration, as he called it, I would just state his terminology, even though I'm uncomfortable with it. One is that he believes that re-equilibration means significant change, but it is within the democratic genus. So French Fourth Republic, French Fifth Republic, whatever you can say about them critically and their institutional lives, formally speaking, they're democratic systems with repeated elections, with winners and losers, sometimes replacing one another. So one democratic form to another, but the structures of the two are supposed to be significantly different. There is some ambivalence on this, as I will return to it, because there are moments when Linz, trying to be hyper realistic, talks about the fact that perhaps the new system can be less democratic than the one before, although I think he's even contradictory on this particular point. But to have somewhat less democracy maybe is worthwhile in order when it avoids a fully authoritarian outcome. I think, as I would keep on saying, these essays are written in the early 1970s, still very close to the French turn from Fourth to Fifth Republic. And obviously the huge personality of Charles de Gaulle influences the discussion. it is pretty clear that that initially de Gaulle was running about 6 months a fully authoritarian system under an emergency, and then subsequently was a system more authoritarian than what came before, perhaps even some people might call it hybrid. François Mitterrand called it a permanent coup d'etat. So certainly to Mitterrand, this was an authoritarian turn. But then it turns out, and the very same man, François Mitterrand, becomes president of that regime, coming from a very different political background than de Gaulle and the first presidents after him. So in the end, this is still a democratic system, but perhaps it has some element of hybridity or authoritarianism built into it. And Linz doesn't want to commit himself too much to this because to some extent, about two texts become recommended, but because of the French example, he can't quite suppress. But in any case, the what, namely to move from one democratic to another democratic system, is hides several issues of how it is done and the preconditions for such an achievement. The how, as I already implied, and this is what brings re-equilibration closer to a hybrid system, is that the means used are supposed to be, if not unconstitutional, then at least aconstitutional, not exactly provided for by the Constitution. So Linz even suggests, and this in fact does not strictly apply to the Fourth to Fifth Republic step, is that illegality can occur at this stage, but it is redeemed by establishing a democratic system and therefore democratic legitimacy. I've been trying to, I haven't undertaken a really serious study of this, but I did look at a few constitutional histories of France just to see how this description applies, and it is a tough case because the way it was done when de Gaulle agreed in the crisis, there's a coup attempt in Algeria, there's a threat of military government in metropolitan France. He's offered a prime ministership. He accepted on conditions. One condition I already mentioned, that he should be able to rule under an emergency set of provisions for a time. Another precondition was, though, that the parliament agrees to making a new constitution. Well, that's nothing as such illegal about that. But the trick here was that the Fourth Republic's constitution already had a well-developed system of amendment and replacement, and that would be both time-consuming given the crisis, and perhaps would not lead to success from de Gaulle's point of view. So his condition was almost explicitly to change the rules of constitutional change, revision of the revision, as the French call it, and this meant that you use the amendment rule of the Fourth Republic to change the amendment rule of the Fourth Republic, so that you can create a process not foreseen under that constitution. This can be called illegal or aconstitutional, and some people might even say it's by definition unconstitutional because an amendment rule belongs to a basic structure that perhaps one should not be able to just simply amend out of existence. In any case, that's how it was done, and the powers that de Gaulle assumed were granted to him under that new structure of rules. So illegality or illegality or quasi-unconstitutional or arguably unconstitutional action belongs to this category. But again, the goal is to reestablish constitutional democracy on a new basis. And the question Linz raises is what are the preconditions? The form is a kind of legitimate but not legal model of change, but under what conditions is that possible? You can really see that he's almost literally writing down what could be the preconditions for de Gaulle's success in France: the availability of uncompromised leadership. This is the context Adam has mentioned. The word charisma is mentioned. The availability of charismatic leadership. It's an interesting question because it's legality legitimacy question. You break legality, the democratic legitimacy is a promise. So what can make such a process legitimate? Well, a charismatic leader certainly can make it in the Weberian sense, if not necessarily in a purely legal sense, legitimate. That, of course, is an important warning, and I'll talk about the counterexample of Brazil, and you correct me if I get it wrong, because in Brazil, in the early 1970s, at least two presidents were deeply impressed by the example of the Fifth Republic, President Quadros and President Goulart, but they were not de Gaulle. I mean, think about what it took for de Gaulle to be de Gaulle, right? To lead France during the Second World War from exile, to help organize the victory, to participate in the actual recovery of France, and then on the top of it, to simply walk away from power when the parliament or the Constituent Assembly did not agree with his ideas. Are all dramatic, and so his aura was great. The way even then President Coty says to a parliament, in order to solve the crisis, I'm going to turn to the most illustrious of all French men. And that was de Gaulle, who actually was not even in Paris at the time and was not involved in the politics directly, though he had many followers and a quasi party that was also supporting him. So that kind of leadership is fundamental. But in order to carry out this type of transformation, that's not in itself enough. You need acceptance on the part of political elites. In other words, those who have been loyal to the previous constitution have to understand that this kind of change is the only way to save constitutional democracy at all. And a relative indifference or passivity of the population. In other words, if indeed the measures undertaken would lead to vast resistance or a counter mobilization, then it would not succeed. As I said, the changes are radical, but they are within the democratic genus, and Von Linz explicitly wants to say that even if it means less democracy temporarily, a hybrid regime, it is justified, since everything is worth avoiding a civil war, thinking of Spain, or the installation of an authoritarian regime. It's a weird thing about our books that the French case is not really represented. There's no chapter to really present it. And so I'm not going to say more about it. I think it would be instructive, certainly, to read at least a history of this process if you're interested in the possible applicability or non-applicability of the model. I wanted to very briefly say that the French Fifth Republic or Fourth to Fifth Republic case may not be the only one where one could speak about this type of redesign, or if you want, redeliberation using his term. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Bruce Ackerman's volumes, We the People. The first volume, he has several chapters, but the first one has the heading of One Constitution, Three Regimes. And of course, the term one constitution does not mean automatically that it is not in some sense also changed. But by those three stages, he means the American regime of the founding. It means the Reconstruction after the Civil War, and he means the New Deal as the two fundamental transformations that have occurred in American history. It's another question which he then later on Ackerman had to kind of think about. But the so-called Reagan Revolution is not like that, and perhaps we could be living through another such a transformation. But certainly in U.S. history, those two events are really pretty dramatic, and they did lead to the redesign of the constitutional system. I would say constitutional democracy, although it is somewhat peculiar to use it for the previous system with its slave population. But in any case, the constitutional republic is redesigned in both of those cases, and one could say that the category applies because in some sense the means used are extra constitutional, but at the same time the constitutional democracy is not only a goal, but it is preserved to a significant extent even through the process. So I would say that the U.S. has these examples, and perhaps history of a lot of countries could point to such moments. One instance, in a somewhat peculiar way, and I don't want to focus on this at all, mentions Mussolini's 1922 turn. It could have been re-equilibrating the constitutional republic up to that particular point by creating a relatively strong government. But then, with his fascist turn, he in fact shifted to a fully authoritarian system. One could say, and you'll see in just a second an example of this, that really that equilibration, the attempt to redesign one kind of democracy into another by using elements of authoritarianism or at least extra legality is a very dangerous process. And certainly, whatever Mussolini might have had in mind in the early 20s, he used the powers that could have used to re-equilibrate in order to establish an authoritarian system. The examples in these volumes, and Arya is right in saying that we should be stressing Latin America. I think you tell that the students that we'll be focusing on Latin America, which is a good reason why not to spend too much time on France or United States. The Latin American case, it's interesting to use to look at some of the cases from point of view of these categories, and then try to decide whether re-equilibration, whether restoration, whether instauration will be the most relevant categories, given the fact that after dictatorships in Latin America, most of the Latin American societies do establish constitutional government. So, what is the relationship of that to the modalities of transformation with their possibly authoritarian elements? The case that's mentioned by Linz in his various introductions, and then added to by Alfred Stepan, are Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil. Linz does not mention Brazil under this heading. But in the really very excellent chapter, I don't know if we didn't have the text, the very excellent chapter of Alfred Stepan on Brazil indicates a strong influence of idea of re-equilibration, and even the example of the French Fourth to Fifth Republic. And so I want to bring it into discussion. It's instructive, probably more instructive than the other two cases. But let me just see what the argument seems to be for Colombia and for Venezuela, which are by implication re-equilibrated. But it's not clear to me if the category applies to them very well. In the case of Colombia, there is a constitutional system of some kind in operation even before the Second World War. It is often referred to as an oligarchic democracy, very much based on political parties as the most important mediation, the most important linkage of citizen and the political order. These parties are accustomed to decision making, which involves one another, independently of who's in power, and agreements among gentlemen, as the author of S.A. Wilde puts it, makes this a particular kind of political system that is not absent in other Latin American cases as well. Consociationalism is often the term used for this, although it's an oligarchic version of it to the extent that it is political party elites that make the deals and not inclusive social political movements. But this is the system, and because of the unwillingness of one major partner to continue to engage in accommodation, it breaks down. So in this presentation, what is Wilde's first name? Correctly, Alexander Wilde presents the Colombian case as a dictatorship between 1949 to 1958, with a military coup in the middle of it, 1953. And perhaps it's interesting that it seems to be two kinds of dictatorships, one based on corporatism, in which the most powerful social groups participate, and the other military rule. It could be called, but it isn't in the literature, also another version of re-equilibration, but a dictatorial one, from one kind of dictatorship to another. This regime represents initially the breakdown of consociational democracy, but it itself breaks down, and this breakdown is then followed by what is described by the return to the previous system in which parties make deals and agreements on a consociational basis. It seems to me it doesn't quite fit into the concept for several reasons. One is that it's 10 years. So if this re-equilibration model of adopted from the French Fourth and Fifth Republic is used here, then the time element for Colombia is much longer. That's the first problem, and the second problem is that Alexander Wilde speaks about the restoration of the oligarchical social system, which would mean that perhaps if it's not exactly a Stuart king or not exactly a Bourbon monarch, but still elites that are still in place and have been excluded for a period by the dictatorship come back to power, they have been restored. It's not re-equilibration in the sense of the replacement of one system by another. I mentioned this, but in spite of these qualms, I also mentioned that in two places, one Linz refers to it as an example of re-equilibration. And so the concept becomes a little bit wider, and the time dimension to which it's applied to it also seems to be different than in the way that he first introduced the concept, then I followed. The Venezuela case is also an interesting puzzle. Unlike Colombia, it does not even have, not only doesn't have oligarchic democracy before the Second World War, but mostly it has various forms of dictatorship. But there is a period, and this is the only reason why the concept should even be relevant, trienio. Correct me if I use the Spanish wrong, but I think that's not too difficult to pronounce. The triennial, 3 years of democratic government under a party that, well, I don't know if it survives under Chavez now, but has survived for quite a long time as the dominant political party, Acción Democrática. Correct my Spanish. A famous president, Betancourt, for example, was from that party, and this party in 45 manages to establish a constitutional democracy. I think probably the initial stages there is a coup as well, but a coup that leads not to military rule, but to the dominant political party. This is an interesting example. Levine, and again, first name, in his essay toward the end, Daniel Levine points to some significant similarities to what was going to happen in Chile something like 25 years, 30 years later, because the Acción Democrática originally was fairly left-wing in its orientation, wants to establish, wants to carry out radical social reforms. One of them involves land reform. Another important thing is the reform of education, which was church controlled previously, and the Acción Democrática at that time was a secularist and to some extent anti-clerical party, as I understand. In any case, the term triennial indicates that this doesn't last long. Emerging in a extra constitutional or like atmosphere, it is also overthrown. And between 1948 and 1958, so 45, 48 is triennial, 48 to 58, there's a dictatorship. Again, it's so funny, the authors kind of think the history, and I would have to really read a lot of Latin American history to actually have some of these little questions answered. I'm not quite sure how Perez Diaz, I think is the name of the dictator. I'm not sure whether he's overthrown in a coup or he is under the impact of a mass movement, just decides to leave Venezuela. This is it's not Perez Diaz, it's Perez Jimenez, January 1958. Yeah, correct me, by the way, if Latin America, I'm very much an amateur in terms of my interest in it, but I obviously made mistakes. And in 58, he leaves. No, why did he leave? Well, people who have that kind of power leave under constraint, and I assume that that's what happened. But what the constraint was, I can't figure out from the text. Doesn't matter. You can all look up the history of any of these countries. What is, I think, striking, and this was written about by a lot of political scientists, was the old parties now come back and they say, well, let's not do again what we did between 45 and 48, which led to military rule then. In other words, let's establish a somewhat different system. Interestingly, this could be called re-equilibration, though I don't think Linz refers to it quite that way, because if the democracy of Acción Democrática between 45 and 48 is pretty majoritarian, this was really a mass movement, a party that had a big mass movement behind it and popular leaders. Now the model becomes consociational. But it's what is particularly interesting for me, because I study these things in another region of the world. This is the new structure is achieved through a pact. Punto fijo, correct me again if I'm not getting, if I get it right. Pacto de punto fijo would be, I guess, in Spanish, which establishes a new system, a consociational system, which could be then called re-equilibration. Again, the 10-year gap seems to make the category not strictly applicable. Or perhaps it could be, and already I think that the author calls it that, the author that I rely on, a democratic transition, which then leads fairly quickly to the consolidation of the system. It lasts until the 1990s, so it is a fairly stable political structure. We will talk about the subsequent histories of some of these places. Whether the term re-equilibration applies here as well, or whether this is not really an instauration or a transition to democracy, to use the later term we're going to be focused on, I think is open. The suspicion that I'm developing as I'm going along is that this French model of re-equilibration does not seem to really find, we can't really find a very good Latin American example of it. In principle, why not? Why couldn't you use constitutional change, some elements of even emergency rule to save democracy rather than destroy it? But I'm not sure if these 10-year periods in Venezuela and Colombia fit into that scheme. For me, the most interesting case is that of Brazil, and this time you're going to have to be the one who corrects the analysis, which is entirely reliant on Alfred Stepan's text, which I would recommend. He has written lots of other things on Brazil, several books. This is just an essay he writes here, but it is a good, a very, very excellent essay and very clear. He's close to Juan Linz, so he actually uses the term re-equilibration. You'll see in just a second in a different way altogether, or at least with a different trajectory than Juan Linz. I knew Alfred Stepan pretty well. With him, I was quite friendly. Knew Juan Linz too, but we were not so friendly. But in any case, independently of my likes and dislikes, I would recommend that if you, I guess the book is not online.
No, but I will get it from.
But
from
if you
the
can get it, I would say that the Stepan essay would be the one would be worth reading. Now, in his case, re-equilibration is used specifically. The term is even used. He's close to Linz to say that in the context of governmental crisis, which was linked to economic challenges and a very high level of social mobilization, with demands that the system was not able to solve. The system of in this case, the early 1960s. The answer, or the response that two presidents, Quadros and Goulart, generate is influenced by the French model. In other words, to transform the system in such a way that governability will be restored, that government is capable of managing economic crisis and perhaps responding to the demands of mobilized parts of the population. So re-equilibration is in their heads, and I can't demonstrate this because I'm historian of Brazil any more than I am of the Spanish American countries, but it really seems like the French example could have played a significant role, at least in the minds of these presidents. Somebody could actually check that biographic. But the interesting turn here is that not only do they fail, but in Stepan's argument, they actually make the crisis worse. In other words, they contribute to the breakdown. Re-equilibration attempt not only does not save the constitutional order such as it was, but actually creates a deeper crisis, which in the end motivates the military to enter and to end the constitutional order for a significant time. Now, what are the means? What are the means that Stepan thinks are particularly problematic? One of them is one that he inherits from von Lins. To bring the military in from the point of view of the Lins school to solve the problems of badly working democracy is suicidal. Not because the military men, never women, right? The military men in power are going to quash democracy, but rather because a significant part of the military entering into power creates a polarization within the military itself. In other words, to the extent that that military men come to be identified with the political system and take on political roles, then political questions become relevant to the rest of the military too. And to the extent that that division in the military then creates the possibility of a very different type of military intervention or action is somehow in the cards. You've seen in the Chilean case, which we discussed, how Allende, and I think that this is where the von Lins idea about the bringing in the military comes from, how Allende desperately tried on two occasions to bring the military into the government. I don't believe that, how do you pronounce his name, João Goulart? João. I don't think that João Goulart actually made soldiers the ministers, but he brought them into the political decision-making process and relied them, thereby creating fundamental tensions within the military itself. And why these tensions would then become particularly fateful is in the Stepan argument, because there's another leg to the strategy of Goulart, namely the mobilization of the population outside the governmental structure, outside the political parties. That to the extent that that military men, at least some of them, become hostile to the process because it happens because also another actor, another set of actors are also brought in. It's not did not just mean masses or populations, but also left-wing parties. The goal of Goulart was to strengthen the presidency and to be able to carry out fundamental reforms. But to the extent that the mass movement relied on the rhetoric of revolution, I mentioned France as an important background to what is going on in Latin American countries, but an equally important country in the context was Cuba. This happened in Brazil, and of course the even more significant part of it, the Chilean breakdown, where Fidel Castro personally even visited the President Allende. The background of the Cuban Revolution and that kind of transformation is one that seems inimical from point of view of not just important social strata, but even sectors of the military. I mean, think about the fact that in the Cuban Revolution, the regular army is entirely replaced, and the new army based on social mobilization is created. There are guerrilla groupings in all the relevant Latin American countries, whether it's Chile or Brazil, and so this too is one that, from point of view of a significant sector of military, unacceptable. So the double strategy of bringing in the military and relying on mass movements leads to a kind of atmosphere in which the idea of the project of re-equilibration cannot really work. Now, in Stefan's presentation, but this I think is one that one could also consider whether some re-equilibrations could be successful even with this particular reservation, is that President Goulart continually speaks against the Constitution, radical constitutional replacement. If this is part of re-equilibration, then the question is whether this type of rhetoric itself weakens his own position, which is constitutional. In other words, to the extent that the president is ready to junk the Constitution, will the military feel the need to respect it? So, as a third possible reason, re-equilibration, because of its relationship to the Constitution, becomes problematic. We mentioned de Gaulle, but de Gaulle had a kind of authority which probably not many political leaders in the 20th century also possessed. And so whether relatively unsuccessful presidents could militate against the Constitution with impunity when their authority was based on it becomes a problem. Well, anyway, how it actually then in the end happens is that there's a naval mutiny which Goulart does not want to suppress because it seemed to be motivated by progressive demands and ideas, but from point of view of the hierarchical military, it represented a dire threat to the integrity of the armed forces. There are always almost every coup or every radical version of regime change, there are also motivating factors. We have the long-term problems which have to do with the origins of the crisis, economic or social. There are short-term phenomena which have to do with the positions that political actors take, and then precipitating factors, which in this case was the naval mutiny. But in any case, the real equilibration process, which was envisioned, or at least which is arguably a way to describe what the incumbents in Brazil were trying to do in order to save themselves, strengthen themselves, and perhaps also save the system. This process itself contributed to the crisis. That, of course, I think raises the question whether that category of re-equilibration is going to be the most useful for the rest of the course, since we'll be dealing with transitions from dictatorial rule or authoritarian rule, but even perhaps the first of these that just mentioned in the case of Venezuela occur in a way that no longer could be described as any kind of re-equilibration, but in a way the creation of a new kind of constitutional system. In the Brazilian case, in the end, there is a democratic transition which occurs then at the end of the military regime, which was inaugurated in 1965, and I think that the more general model that will be relevant to us from the rest of the course is not how, in the midst of a crisis or on the verge of a breakdown, a system is reconstructed. There are few possible examples of that, but rather how, after a significant period of authoritarian rule, transformation is also possible. That would be, of course, the second wave, if you want, the second wave of democratization, which we will return to after next week when we take a brief trip to the United States. So please, I'm done, and I think a discussion of whether the abstract model or of these cases and this fair game. And when it comes to some of the countries, I think that some people in the room will know more about it than I would, which is good because I want to bring in your various local knowledge and understandings to understand the cases better. So please. You have to speak up. Yeah.
The discussion with Colombia conflict is that any model look compared to the French model. Like, why do you think? Why is it time? Why is time an issue?
Well, I mean, just in terms of talking about a kind of social process, right? France could have had wound up having a dictatorship. That's a lot of the Gaulle supporters in Algeria. That's what they wanted, right? And it would be interesting if you just study the 6 or so months when de Gaulle still ruled by decree, which one would say is a relatively dictatorial modality. But surely, from point of view of 20th century dictatorships, France is not a dictatorship even in that period, right? So it's a zero with respect to dictatorship. It's zero dictatorship, though the means used are not strictly constitutional, not strictly legal, not envisioned by the framers of the Fourth Republic, all the rest, but still, in a way, not only do you go from constitutional democracy to constitutional democracy, but in a way, in the process, a lot of things don't happen. I mean, the press of the left is not suppressed in this period of de Gaulle, right? Political parties are not closed down. There is repression, but the repression is against generals who in Algeria don't want to accept the fact that de Gaulle didn't turn out to be what they imagined, and they rebel against him as well. So in the case of some of their leaders, there is retribution. But I don't know if anybody has. I'm sure in France people have studied the statistics involved. The level of repression is pretty much targeted to actual crimes, or in this case, treason on the part of military figures. I think that some civilians like Soustelle also wind up in prison, but not for long, and then in the end, and certainly no executions, no terror, and the society, in terms of most of its established processes, continues to function. So, in a way, though you could say there is a kind of linkage of the authoritarian regimes we're talking about, and at this period in France, that linkage is on a very formal level, and it is not, from a social point of view, an authoritarian setting. That's all avoided. Now, had de Gaulle been different, had he chose to create a personalistic or some kind of institutionally established form of dictatorship, then it would have been different, but he did not. Now, the process, it's hard to separate from the person, but at least we can say that it avoids dictatorship, avoids authoritarian rule, even if some of the means at a certain moment resemble what authoritarians use. Now, when you actually talk about a 10-year period, I think both Venezuela and Colombia, these are 10-year periods, then all the trappings of dictatorship are there. Now, I don't know, I can't, it would take a good history of Latin America to really check and compare, but I'm sure newspapers are closed down. I'm sure political opponents, not military rebels, but political opponents of all kinds, are forced into exile or are jailed. So then, you have a kind of transformation that goes into the society on a much deeper and more fundamental level than what we talk about in France. So the time, I think your point was, why should the time be matter? But in fact, the time is an indication of a social political process in those cases and not in France. So real equilibration means that in a way you are saving. Now, was that in de Gaulle's mind? Who knows? But in the end, it means saving constitutional democracy. Yeah.
I want to ask, to pick it up before that question. It seems to me that when you speak about re-equilibration, it seems to me that it sounds more like restoration, more like instauration of a new type of regime. That be correct to say?
Well, yeah. I'm sort of sticking, it's weird because the three things, restoration, just call it his terms, instauration and reequilibration, all have something in common, right? They all actually, in some way, end the system and introduce a new one, right? They have in common, but I think that restoration, and maybe this is why I stressed the English and French histories, means in some ways you go back to what you had before, and that would mean constitutional change with respect to the authoritarian interlude, but it would mean constitutional preservation. It would be a very, actually, restoration is a very conservative form, right? Restoration is a really conservative form. Perhaps if you wanted to have a scale of conservative to radical change, then restoration is the most conservative. Reequilibration has the shortest time. So if you look at the time dimension, then reequilibration is one end and instauration is the other end. If you look at level of change, then restoration is one end, and of course instauration is the other, new constitution. Now reequilibration, the Fifth Republic's constitution is pretty different than the Fourth. And you could say that in the case of the other example here, Venezuela, which has the 10-year dictatorship also, but the constitutional system of Punto Fino is a constitutional one, whereas the previous one under the AD was a majoritarian radical triennial system. So you could say that to the extent that we can speak about a reequilibration model in more than just France, and I'm having some difficulty with this. Maybe it's my own fault that I'm interpreting too literally the French background to the Linds's argument. But to that extent, one can say that this modality does change constitution. So it means constitutional change. Restoration means, even in constitutional terms, I think you can probably look up how many constitutions have actually been restored in Latin America, not actually replaced by a new one, but going back to an old one. I think that probably you would be able to find 4 or 5 examples of such constitutional restoration. So I think that it depends on, when you compare these three, you can distinguish according to the time dimension, which Adam is right, it may not be. And then the level of change. And certainly the integration model implies the largest level of change. But the restoration model, strictly, if Alexander Wild is right about Colombia, and I could be corrected, but he keeps on saying the oligarchical democracy of before the dictatorship is entirely restored. Is restored in the process of return to democracy.
I mean,
So a strict restoration.
in that sense, can we just use consolidation? I mean, maybe consolidation
But
is
that-
a word for democracy. Then
That we will introduce in a while, right? Because any of these things, right? Whether it's the Fifth Republic's reequilibration, whether it is a restoration of a previous system, whether it is a creation of a new one, the problem, its consolidation becomes a separate issue in each of those cases, right? Because you establish a system, it exists on paper if you made a new constitution, it exists in terms of the governmental will it be accepted by a significant number of people as a system which is either the best or at least the second or third best, better than the alternative? But in any case, is it a system, I think, using the Lincean categories, which creates a significant number of people who are constitutionally loyal, not semi-loyal, certainly not disloyal. A large number of people are constitutionally loyal. In other words, who might say, I don't like the government, I don't like some of the figures who make decisions, but I wouldn't want to replace them at the cost of the system. The system, you want to replace them within the system. I'm loyal to its procedures, to its practices, and I want to replace government to the next election, let's say. And that would come up in any of these settings. So think about. I mean, it's a funny example. Mitterrand's idea of a permanent coup d'état. Mitterrand belonged to the Socialist Party. He was not of the most left-wing faction within the party, but he was a leftist, certainly in the period well before he became president himself. But was he disloyal to the Fifth Republic? Well, looks like not. So it's an interesting question about communist parties in all European countries, and that would be Latin American countries too. Because in theory they are all disloyal. And when a communist party is imagining a replacement of the whole system, of which the political is only its superstructure. But in their practice, I mean, think about, for example, the role of the Chilean Communist Party during the period. It is entirely loyal to the constitutional system as it was established. It is, if you want, and if you can portray the Allende government, the Communist Party is on its right. Some of the elements of the Socialist Party are to its left, and of course the guerrillas and the various radical left organizations are well to the left. So, you can be a communist, and I would say the Italian Communist Party, I mean, what's the idea of the historical compromise and all the rest, certainly became a system-loyal party. And so what the consolidation of a system means is that the number of politically active people who are totally loyal to the procedures and rules and practices of the system is much greater. I don't want to say everybody, but who is much, much greater than those who reject those things, or at most are willing to use them instrumentally for a particular purpose. So consolidation applies to all these categories. And obviously, when was de Gaulle's Fifth Republic, on this issue of re-equilibration today, when is this Fifth Republic consolidated? Not right away, right? He has to put up with very serious military rebellions. Would he still be followed? The fact is that in one of his first speeches, he still says Algeria is French, and never again. So once he actually begins to abandon the idea of Algeria as French, then of course the threat on the side of the military that actually helped him to come to power becomes serious. Yet he manages it. There are even assassination attempts. I think you might have even seen a film where there's an attempt to assassinate de Gaulle by the OAS, the radical wing of the Algerian military. So it doesn't matter which form we're talking about. Its consolidation is still always a task because there's an old regime. It has people who are its beneficiaries. It has also people who have committed, who have done things under it, and now in a new regime could be under threat. There could be trials. There could be investigations. There could be confiscation of ill-gotten gains. So there are all kinds of people who, a variety of reasons, practical, ideological, political, are still attached to the old. And consolidation means that the balance between them and the rest is reduced. That they continue to exist. They always continue to exist. Now, when the number is going the other way, right? We're going to talk United States, right? But a number of people who, this I think Mitt Romney just now in his speech, where he said he's getting out of politics, right? Did you see it? And what did he say about the Republican Party? An increasingly large part of the Republican Party now has no loyalty for the Constitution, says Mitt Romney, who's not in bad position to know it, right? I mean, he knows these people. Now, of course, it could be a polemical reason, and he's attacking other people in the party. But I think that you could also have that, and obviously, in the course where we talk about cycles, and that is the gist of the breakdown analysis as Linz has pioneered it. How does he put it? He puts it, the number of people who, many of the loyals become semi-loyal. Many of the semi-loyal become disloyal. Some of the disloyal who are disloyal to government become disloyal to their regime. So if all those numbers shift in that direction, right? If all the numbers shift from loyal to semi-loyal, from semi-loyal to disloyal, from disloyal with respect to government to disloyal to the regime. Disloyal really means regime, basically, disloyal to the regime. If those numbers increase, then of course the authoritarian threat increases as well. Linz tends to, at least this school for a while, tends to de-emphasize the role of completely disloyal elements in the breakdown of system. But of course, they do play a significant role, and I think the tendency in that direction from people who have been treated. It is especially important in the military, right? The military, where you could say abstractly, also there are always people who are very legalistic, and there are always people who, would be interested in a much more powerful share of rules, so who are potentially putschists or golpistas, and in the military, that shift again would be. That's the thing that we were talking about. Goulard's mistake is that he is bringing in the military in a paradoxical way has weakened the constitutionalists in the military and strengthened the golpistas. That's not the Portuguese term for it. Is golpistas, it works in Portuguese too. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of the question of reintegration in more recent, perhaps Latin American examples. I'm not sure if it quite fits, but the question is, how do we think about all of these? There's been a lot of debate about it, but like the soft coups or judiciary, parliamentary coups that brought that I mean, generated a re-equilibrium of the democratic regimes in Latin America in the last 20 years. I don't know, like Bolivia 2019, where you have I don't know, some form of I mean, so the question of the combination, the transition from one democratic regime to another democratic regime that is mediated through illegal or semi-legal forms, like using the parliament to say that the president is crazy, and that is combined with mobilization in the streets. I mean, we have like Celaya, Honduras, Paraguay, Lugo, Dilma even. If those could be thought of as cases of re-equilibration, because the resulting is another democratic regime where there's not a constitutional change, but the parties that were in power before are no longer in power. So there is some sort of re-equilibration.
It's amazing that you're saying this, because I thought of this. also. So that means great minds think alike.
Yeah, that.
I was not going to bring in this period, right, which is actually after the transition school finished talking about consolidation, right? This is now after consolidation, what you're raising. But a significant number of places, and in this case, I don't know if Latin America has more cases than the rest of the world, but certainly you could talk about Turkey in this case, you could talk about Hungary in this case, you could talk about Poland in this case, maybe even the Russian road from Yeltsin to Putin was of this kind. So it is not, none of these places have a coup example. And of course, well, we have a section of the course which is readings exactly on these type of cases. I was trying to look up of just how many weeks from now we're going to get to them through my, it's the backsliding literature, week 9, October 30, Levitsky, Tzipla, Ginsburg, Hook, Main War against Perez Linan, with respect to Latin America. So you have now a whole range of cases like that. We all know that, right? And this is something that is in the syllabus. But I think that the question you raised, and I did think of it, so I don't want to, weaken the fact that you made the point, but it did really hit me. Is what about this re-equilibration, which Linz concedes? He doesn't use the word hybridity, but if you actually think about it, well, it would be worse if the thing collapsed, right? He says, and if you use some authoritarian element in order to save it, well, of course, that may be correct in lots of instances, but hybridity then becomes in itself a problem of de-democratization, because once a trend like that starts, I mean, you can see how, in lots of places, an attack on the courts that is the first beginning, because the courts would give opposition and media and mobilization as a form of protection. So weakening the courts, weakening the press, weakening, well, or strengthening certain powers within the states which the ruling party controls. These are elements of hybridization. Now, how different are these? That's the point you made. How different is this than re-equilibration? Now, if we think about it in terms of purpose, which is going to be very misleading, then we could say, well, the goal of re-equilibration is to save democracy, and the goal of backsliding is to slowly, in a politically viable way, dismantle it, or at least head toward making it more authoritarian, less democratic. So the goal seems to be different. But it is not, it's maybe misleading to think in terms of the goal. I mean, I'm sure there are excellent biographies of Charles de Gaulle, and it'd be worthwhile to study that case if you're interested in this particular problem. What was he thinking was going to be the result of what he wanted? Did he really think about the Fifth Republic as it finally was functioning, allowing alternation, high levels of social political freedom, mobilization, all the rest, eventually socialist president coming to power? Did de Gaulle envision this? Is this what he was thinking of? So purpose is not clear what the purpose is in any one of these instances. And conversely, are all the backsliders wishing to dismantle democracy? Or are they also trying to, in some way, strengthen governability, which arguably is a precondition for a democratic system to function? So there is it's something that we can look at again when we look at the literature on backsliding and de-democratization and gradual transformation of democracy by political rulers, or at least by leading political forces. But at least as a possibility. We have to keep in mind that this also seems related to re-equilibration, and you know the example of the Fourth, Fifth Republic in France, Fourth Republic in France could be very misleading. De Gaulle gave one famous speech where he said, "You know, you think at age 65 I want to be a dictator?" Literally said that, right? Well, you know, look at Trump. He's 77. You know, age is not the point. And of course, in his case, you know, it would be interesting to read a biography because it's an interesting personality who walked away from politics twice. He walked away in 46 and walked away in 68 or 9 also when he lost the referendum. So this is not exactly the Trump type, right? Who even when he loses doesn't want to walk away. So it's but you can't you know the point that you're raising is a kind of structural one, and you can't resolve it by talking about people. I mean, had Goulart succeeded in transforming the system as he wanted, what would he have done afterwards? I mean, obviously, it would not have been a military regime after 65, but it could have been a pre-authoritarian one that he would have designed had he had a chance to do it. So it's structurally remains a question whether hybridization is de-democratization or whether it is perhaps a way of saving democracy. It really depends on a lot of things, and not just the leader, but also, of course, the social forces which are present at the time. But I like that particular question a lot. Please, anybody else? You can see already that, you know, not talking about next week now, but the subsequent weeks readings, you know, transition are kind of we're on the borderline of talking about those cases, and at least in one instance, in the case of Venezuela, as Levine presents it, Donald Levine presents it, you can see that breakdown could be then followed by a transition to democracy, and transition to democracy then becomes an additional category which may fall under the heading of what Linz called instauration here. But in any case, those cases where dictatorships were established, I think most of the cases lasting longer, the Brazilian one, 1965 to 85. So it's a 20-year-old one. In Chile, 73 to 89, let's say, is a 16-year-old one. You know, so the next problem that we'll be dealing with is not how dictatorships, which are possible and which could follow after a breakdown, are in some ways to be managed or avoided, but rather what happens after that. And the literature turns to that particular topic, and we'll have those readings are the O'Donnell Schmitter said that's available.
Yes.
Okay, so we only had the reading problem here. That's gonna be, I would suggest, now Adam will give us some reading for next week, but I would suggest that beginning to read the transition volumes, I think, would be a good idea. And then we will have your presentation on two of them. Okay. Anybody? Oh, yeah, please.
People that pay price, as mine is.
Well, I mean, all I can say is that in terms of just my reading of basically this one essay by Stefan, that re-equilibration to at least two Brazilian presidents seems to be the thing that one has to do because the system is working poorly. There are economic challenges which cannot be met. The population is mobilized, and the demands are made which government is not strong enough to really respond to. So you really need government strengthening. Governmentality has to be strengthened. Now, I have no evidence that they are influenced directly by the French example. All I know is that Alfred Stepan uses this particular term derived from the French model for the Brazilian case, and I found it striking that he leaves open whether the crisis has gotten worse because of those attempts. In other words, how do you? What is the? You kind of ask yourself if you are in the position of President João Goulart, how do you establish a strong government in a place where there are all kinds of challenges have dramatically weakened it for a significant period? And in some way, what he thought, seems to make sense. You get the support of the military on the one side, and you get mass support on the other side. And so, in that sense, what he envisioned was that getting that kind of support in society could not be resisted by the political parties that have helped to disorganize the system up to that point. And in principle, that's a good idea, but trying to do both of these things. Now, I think it would be interesting is to did de Gaulle actually turn to the masses? Did he attempt to mobilize popular forces behind his constitutional change? I think that one of the points that Lynn stresses in this context is that it's not that the voters and the various social strata they should not be hostile to the idea of redesigning the system, but they should also not participate. I mean, the relative passivity of the masses, says Lynch. And I think that Goulart tried to both mobilize and to get institutional support from the holders of the means of violence. And perhaps this way of re-equilibrating, on the one side, increase the social economic demands of mobilized people. On the other side, threatened the military, and even in spite of the fact that he's including military leaders within the government, a significant part of the military elite becomes hostile. So, the idea, they don't have the essay, right? So, of Stepan, which is from this volume. I'm not suggesting if it's right or wrong, but I think that the attempt to save a political system on the basis of such appeal to different sectors of the population was is a difficult thing to achieve. You know, in this sense, real equilibration as Lynch presents it may be a fairly unique political device. Now, of course, you could say, what's re-equilibration and what is reform? And certainly, social political reform have been successful in lots of countries in different political epochs. I mean, we saw the Chilean case. What if Allende didn't win that election? 70. The Christian Democrats won it, and they continued to carry on the reformism of the previous 5 years. Chile was closest to becoming a social democratic country, not in the sense of socialism, but in the sense of reformism, redistribution, government intervention in the economy. Why Allende himself could not do it, one can explain on the basis of his complex support. But Chile could have had that, and so in that sense, you could say that you can't exclude the possibility of social reform. If the time element in restoration, in instauration is long, in restoration relatively short, in re-equilibration is zero or very short, then for a successful reform process, the time dimension must be minus. That is, it has to occur well before the crisis phenomena would occur that would bring the system under dramatic threat. And so, you could say that Christian democratic reformism in Chile was a possible way, but through the workings of the political system, much more radical force came to power. And so, in that sense, re-equilibration might have been an imaginable solution, but I don't think in the Chilean case, you could say, together with Stepan's essay on Brazil and Goulart, that Allende bringing in soldiers into the government was an attempt at re-equilibration. I mean, it's a pretty strange thing for a socialist leader who is linked to the pacifist and anti-war, anti-militaristic tradition of the left to bring in military men. And what is he trying to do? Well, you could say that was a little like Goulart's attempt at re-equilibration. You want to strengthen the government. Bringing in soldiers is never in itself a democratic tool, right? At most, it means, at worst, it means bringing technocrats. And at worst, it means bringing in relatively authoritarian figures who you hope will help dismantle the challenges. So you could say that there too you could speak about an attempt at re-equilibration. I don't think Allende had constitutional plans, and in a sense, they weren't even needed because Christian Democrats in the previous 5 years made the presidency quite strong. But bringing in the military could have been an attempt to, that's what re-equilibration seems to mean, is that you use some authoritarian devices to avoid authoritarian outcome, to kind of preempted or subverted, and well, as far as this discussion is correct, as far as my analysis is correct, it succeeds very rarely. It could make things worse, as in Brazil, or it could be actually replaced by a different device, as in the restoration and the new constitutional making efforts subsequently. So it is a very rare political. It's a political tool that rarely succeeds. But I paid a lot of attention to it because of the Linz essay, and because I see it appear in the other cases. But the more I think about it, the less convincing it is that this is actually a way that democracy can be seen. We're going to have a lecture by Emanuele Guerrisoli on emergency rule, right? Emergency rule. He's writing a dissertation on it. He's focusing on the United States. Is the application of emergency provisions of Constitution also not somehow linked to re-equilibration? I mean, you think about, President Lincoln's suspended habeas corpus. You think about different emergency provisions used in constitutional crisis. Also, was part of the French Fourth Republic crisis. Shift to emergency provisions, and to go use them too. I mean, you could say that emergency provisions are constitutions providing for an element of re-equilibration. When they come under fundamental threat, they give a kind of tool to political leaders to temporarily use authoritarian means, not in order to establish a dictatorship, but in fact to avoid it, or to at least weaken the enemies of the regime that could bring it down. Now, Emanuel's argument is going to be that every single time this happens in the United States, it makes the country more authoritarian. So it is not a neutral tool. Or think about the most famous case is the emergency provisions of the Weimar Constitution in Germany, right? Being from basically 1930 to 33, there are presidential governments in Weimar, for which there was a provision in the Constitution, but mostly they ruled by emergency decrees. And you could say, well, in the minds of some people, probably not President Hindenburg, but in the minds of some people, the point of this was to stave off threats against the Weimar democracy coming from left and right both. What's the outcome? Well, the outcome is Hitler, who gets one of these governments himself. So there is an argument that constitutions try to provide for an element of re-equilibration, but this is a very dangerous tool, which, when used, could turn into just the opposite. If the Weimar emergency government were to stop the National Socialists, in the end, they enabled them to come to power. Yes.
trying.
Well, you know, I think that this, I mean, he mentions Pareto, Linz, but I think that this whole re-equilibration idea, in that the way they use it, has a kind of economic background. That is, one kind of assumes that you know that in sort of liberal economics, right, liberal political economy, that in a functioning market system, supply and demand balance one another, and that economic functioning on the part of you know complex system of division of labors works in a way as to produce relatively positive outcomes for all the participants. Crises are the breakdowns of that equilibrium. So you could say that in the realm of economics, since Keynes, we talked about this, right? A kind of re-equilibration can occur through government interventionism, and from point of view of the economic actors, that is, of course, is negative, right? Because the economic actors and the participants would like to see themselves as the dominant actors within the system, whose actions produce some kind of equilibrium. It no longer can do it, so the state intervenes, and it does so through fiscal and monetary policy. It could do so through even more radical means. For example, taking over some firms, some nationalizations. Keynes was not in favor of them, but they could also belong to that type of logic. So in that sense, economic state interventionism into the economy is similar to political re-equilibration. But then the question is whether that similarity, you know, can be maintained fully. So if that's where the concept comes from, then of course one also has to see where the fundamental differences lie. Because if you use authoritarian means against the normal processes of political life, then the question is whether those authoritarian means could not become self-reproducing, would not create incentives for actors to establish a different system, and I think that's that was I think even Mitterrand's fear of de Gaulle's political redesign of the system. In the economic realm, I suppose it would be well, certainly many people on the economic right or the political right claim this, that interventionism by the state would lead to a kind of statization, a kind of state control of the economy as a whole. And social democrats and Keynesians have been often accused of aiming at that. But we now know pretty much that you know, once the equilibrium is restored in these capitalist contexts, the state tends to reduce its counter-cyclical activities. But would this work in the political realm too? So whether this analogy from economics is one that would be a dangerous sign, because it would work differently in the economy than work in the political or than in the economy. I think we have to leave open, and I'm not sure. You know, it would be interesting to look at to see if there are other good examples of political attempts of this kind and what their outcome is. One could say that I mentioned these examples from the United States that in the period of the Civil War, many constitutional protections were removed, but they were restored subsequently. And so, in a sense, the political equilibration worked like the economic, supposed to in the Keynesian theory. But that would depend, I think, on whether it would work like that would depend on political leaderships. I mean, it's extremely possible that once the authoritarian process starts, and this would be, I think, for the issues that Luis brings up, they have a kind of accelerating, self-reproducing, self-reinforcing quality. So these, you could say, some of the measures that we describe as backsliding could be economic, politically defensible, but what are the consequences and what will be the next step and wherever they head? And I think it's an area where when one probably sees danger signs, and this I think would be something we could examine 3 or so weeks from now, and we'll look at the literature on backsliding, on de-democratization, on hybridization. Certainly, in some cases, you could say that the authoritarian outcome seems pretty clear. Russia, let's say, would prime example, right? But maybe Venezuela now, in this new historical epoch, is another. So, re-equilibration, if the term even is to be used, would have different consequences in politics, or could have very different consequences in politics than in economics, from where the term, I think, has been adopted. Okay. Thanks. You'll get us some.